In the spring of 1944, the skies over Europe thundered with the daily struggle for air dominance. The Allies had turned the tide of war, pushing deep into occupied territory, their bombers flying in massive formations toward the industrial heart of Germany. Escorting them were the new American long-range fighters, the North American P-51 Mustangs. Fast, agile, and with a range far beyond any fighter before it, the Mustang had become the nightmare of every Luftwaffe pilot. But one fateful day, fortune shifted. Somewhere over the northern fields of Germany, a P-51 was brought down, not in flames but intact. Its pilot, forced to bail out after sustaining engine trouble from flak damage, left behind one of the most advanced fighter aircraft the world had ever seen. When German ground units reached the crash site, they were stunned. The aircraft lay half-buried in a field near Bad Zwischenahn, its polished aluminum skin glinting under the overcast sky. The men who approached it could hardly believe what they were looking at. Painted in olive drab and bearing the white star of the United States Army Air Forces, the fighter appeared remarkably undamaged. The Luftwaffe's technical officers were immediately notified, and within hours, the Mustang was secured and transported to a testing facility under strict secrecy. To the German High Command, this was no ordinary trophy, it was an opportunity. By 1944, Germany's Air Force was under relentless pressure. Allied bombers struck oil refineries, factories, and railways with increasing precision, and the Luftwaffe's once dominant fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190, were showing their age. Now with a captured Mustang in their possession, German engineers hoped to uncover the technological secrets that allowed the Allies to seize air superiority. The aircraft, later identified as a P-51B 7NA Mustang, was meticulously examined by the Luftwaffe's testing division at Rechlin airfield, the center of Germany's aviation research. Every inch of the airframe was inspected, the laminar flow wing design, the streamlined fuselage, and most intriguingly, the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The Germans had long respected British engineering, but they were astonished by the combination of performance and endurance achieved by the Americans through mass production and precision, manufacturing. Luftwaffe engineers and test pilots alike marveled at the Mustang's cockpit layout. It was simple yet efficient. Instrumentation was clean, controls intuitive, and visibility unmatched. The bubble canopy, though still in early use, provided the pilot with a panoramic view that was revolutionary for its time. Compared to the cramped confines of the Bf 109's cockpit, the Mustang felt like a leap into the future. When test pilot Hans-Werner Lerche was assigned to fly the captured aircraft, he reportedly approached it with both skepticism and curiosity. The Germans had captured Allied planes before, a few Spitfires, some P-47 Thunderbolts, but none had left such an impression. As the Merlin engine roared to life, Lerche immediately noticed the smoothness of its operation. The aircraft accelerated down the runway with minimal vibration, lifting off effortlessly into the crisp northern air. Within minutes, the reports began. The Mustang climbed faster than most German fighters and retained speed even in steep turns. Its balance between stability and responsiveness was unlike anything the Luftwaffe had produced. At cruising altitude, it handled with a precision that stunned even seasoned pilots. In radio transmissions and later debriefings, Lerche and his fellow test pilots admitted something remarkable. No German aircraft, not even the latest models, flew quite like the Mustang. What the Luftwaffe had captured that day was not just an enemy machine. It was a glimpse into the engineering philosophy that defined the Allied war effort: speed, efficiency, and adaptability. The P-51 Mustang was not only a fighter, it was a symbol of industrial superiority and aerodynamic innovation. And for the German test pilots who flew it, the experience would forever change their understanding of what air power could truly achieve. At Rechlin Airfield, the Luftwaffe's nerve center for aircraft evaluation, the captured P-51 Mustang was treated with the same reverence one might reserve for an alien artifact. Engineers, technicians, and pilots surrounded it daily, drawn by the sleek lines and precision craftsmanship that seemed to defy everything Germany's war factories had endured under Allied bombardment. In a war increasingly defined by attrition, this single aircraft offered insight into the industrial and aerodynamic genius of the enemy. The Mustang, identified as Eddie Rickenbacker from its faded nose art, had been damaged in its coolant system, but the airframe remained almost pristine. German engineers began their work methodically. Panels were removed, instruments catalogued, and the Merlin V-1650-3 engine disassembled under the supervision of technical officers. When they examined the laminar flow wing, so thin and perfectly contoured that it seemed to slice the air itself, they were astonished. It reduced drag to a degree German designs hadn't achieved even in their most advanced prototypes. The Focke-Wulf 190's thick radial design and the Messerschmitt's angular frame suddenly felt archaic by comparison. The Mustang's aerodynamic efficiency wasn't merely theoretical. It was the reason American fighters could escort bombers from England deep into Germany and back without refueling. For the engineers at Rechlin, this was a revelation as troubling as it was enlightening. The Mustang's heart, the Packard-built Merlin engine, was the true marvel. Based on the British Rolls-Royce Merlin 61, the Americans had re-engineered it for mass production without losing an ounce of performance. It featured a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that maintained power at high altitude, allowing Mustangs to meet and outclimb enemy aircraft even over 30,000 feet. The Germans had their own high-altitude engines, like the Daimler-Benz DB605 and the BMW 801D, but these power plants struggled under the strain of poor fuel quality and a crippled supply chain. The Americans, by contrast, had standardized 100 and 150 octane fuel that made the Merlin's performance consistently lethal. As the days passed, Rechlin's pilots took turns flying the Mustang, logging detailed reports after each flight. Their consensus was almost unanimous. The aircraft's handling was superb. It rolled smoothly, responded instantly, and never punished mistakes. Where the Bf 109 required constant rudder correction and the FW-190 demanded physical strength, the Mustang seemed to anticipate its pilot's will. "It flies as if balanced on thought alone," one pilot noted in his log. Even Luftwaffe veterans hardened by years of combat felt a grudging admiration. In debriefings, they admitted that if German pilots had flown such machines, the outcome of the air war might have been far different. Beyond flight performance, the Americans had achieved something the Germans could scarcely replicate in 1944: standardization. Every bolt panel and instrument in the Mustang adhered to precise tolerances. Replacement parts fit perfectly across production batches, a testament to U.S. industrial efficiency. By contrast, German aircraft, though technically advanced, often varied subtly between production runs due to material shortages and factory disruptions. To the Rechlin engineers, this uniformity represented an industrial advantage as decisive as any tactical innovation. In a sense, the Mustang embodied the entire American war machine, technological mastery fused with manufacturing scale. Yet for all their fascination, the Germans knew this captured marvel could do little to alter their fate. By the time the Mustang was being tested, the Allies had achieved near total air superiority. The Luftwaffe was exhausted, its aces either dead, captured, or grounded by fuel shortages. The captured Mustang was a triumph of engineering intelligence, but also a haunting reminder. It was proof that the enemy had not only outbuilt and outnumbered them, but had also outthought them. What began as curiosity soon turned into quiet respect. In the Mustang's metal skin and roaring engine, Germany's finest engineers saw the embodiment of an idea they could no longer hope to match. The war had moved beyond bravery and skill. It was now fought through innovation, precision, and relentless production. And in that race, the Mustang had already won. By late summer of 1944, the captured P-51 Mustang had become the most closely studied aircraft in the Third Reich. At Rechlin, where the Luftwaffe tested everything from experimental jet prototypes to captured enemy fighters, the Mustang occupied a unique position, an enemy machine that commanded absolute respect. The airfield buzzed each time it was rolled from its hangar, the polished American aluminum now repainted in German markings, a black cross on its fuselage where the white U.S. star once gleamed. Yet beneath its skin it remained unmistakably American. The responsibility for flying the Mustang fell to one of the Luftwaffe's most accomplished evaluation pilots, Captain Hans-Werner Lerche, a man who had flown nearly every aircraft of the war, British Spitfires, Soviet Yaks, American Thunderbolts. Lerche, approached the Mustang with a blend of curiosity and caution. His notes would later become legendary within the Luftwaffe archives, detailing not just performance metrics, but the psychological weight of flying a machine that symbolized the enemy's ascendancy. On his first flight, the Mustang impressed him immediately. The Packard-built Merlin engine roared to life with a smoothness unfamiliar to German ears. Acceleration down the runway was swift and steady, the aircraft lifting gracefully into the northern sky. Lercher recorded his first impressions with precision. Climbs easily, no torque roll, excellent visibility, surprisingly light on controls. He pushed the aircraft through a series of tests, steep turns, dives, high-speed climbs, and found that it responded predictably and without strain. Its stability at high speeds astonished him. While most Luftwaffe fighters tended to stiffen or lose control authority above 400 miles per hour, the Mustang retained composure and responsiveness. Even during simulated dogfights against a Bf-109 flown by another test pilot, the American aircraft demonstrated an advantage that could not be ignored. It accelerated faster out of turns and retained energy through maneuvers that would have bled speed from most German fighters. When Lerch landed after that first test, the ground crew noted the unusual expression on his face, not the analytical focus of a test pilot, but something bordering on awe. In his debriefing, Lercher admitted that the Mustang's balance between speed, agility, and endurance represented a level of aerodynamic harmony our current designs cannot yet achieve. Over the next several weeks, Rechlin conducted more detailed comparisons. The Mustang was flown against the Luftwaffe's premier interceptors, the Bf-109G6 and the Fw-190A8, in simulated engagements designed to evaluate turning radius, rate of climb, and sustained energy. Each time the results were the same. While the German aircraft could outturn the Mustang at lower speeds and altitudes, the P-51 dominated in sustained climbs and high-speed maneuvers. In combat terms, that meant the American pilots could dictate the terms of engagement, choosing when to fight and when to disengage. That, more than raw speed, was the secret to Allied air supremacy. The Mustang's long range also baffled German analysts. With drop tanks, it could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back, something no German fighter could dream of matching. Even the twin-engine Messerschmitt Me-410 or the new jet-powered Me-262 couldn't provide consistent long-range coverage. The Luftwaffe's entire defensive strategy was built around short-range interceptors, scrambling to meet bomber formations, while the Americans were now striking deep into the Reich with constant fighter protection. It was, the engineers concluded, a logistical revolution as much as a tactical one. What disturbed the Germans most, however, wasn't just the Mustang's performance, it was its accessibility. Nothing about its construction seemed exotic or unattainable. The metallurgy, the design principles, the aerodynamics, all within German comprehension. What they lacked was the means to replicate it under constant bombing, fuel shortages, and disarray. The Mustang's genius lay not only in innovation, but in execution. Thousands of identical machines built efficiently, maintained easily, and flown by well-trained pilots, backed by abundant fuel and parts. By the end of the testing program, the German pilots' reports read less like analysis and more like confession. They admitted, often reluctantly, that the Mustang was perhaps the finest all-around piston fighter ever built. For men who had grown up believing in the superiority of German engineering, this revelation was painful. But it was undeniable. In the skies above Europe, the balance of power had shifted, and now even those who once ruled the air could no longer ignore the truth. The Mustang had changed everything. Chapter 4. The circus takes flight. By the autumn of 1944, the captured Mustang, now officially designated T9+HK, left the confines of Rechlin and joined one of the most unusual Luftwaffe units ever assembled, the Wanderzirkus Rosarius, or Rosarius's traveling circus. This elite detachment, named after its commander, Theodor Rosarius, had a singular and haunting purpose: to take captured Allied aircraft on tour across German-occupied Europe and show frontline pilots what they were truly up against. Wherever the circus arrived, it drew crowds of Luftwaffe personnel, engineers, and officers. To see a Mustang, a Lightning, or a Thunderbolt taxi across a German airfield bearing black crosses instead of white stars was an eerie sight, one that carried both fascination and unease. These aircraft, once symbols of the enemy's dominance, now served as grim tutors in the art of survival. The Mustang, repainted in yellow recognition bands and German codes, became the star of the show. Pilots watched in awe as it taxied before them, its Merlin engine snarling with restrained fury. The presentation always began with a detailed briefing, charts, performance graphs, and tactical analysis, delivered by Rosarius himself or one of his seasoned test pilots. They spoke calmly, scientifically, but every word carried an undertone of revelation. This aircraft is faster. It climbs higher. It can fight you on its terms. The message was clear. If the Luftwaffe was to survive, it had to understand the enemy not as propaganda, but as fact. Then came the flying demonstrations. The Mustang would take to the sky, often alongside a Bf 109 or FW 190, performing side-by-side comparisons that stripped away illusion. German pilots, many of whom had lost comrades to P-51s over France or the Ruhr, watched as the captured fighter accelerated faster, rolled smoother, and soared higher. The contrast was undeniable. Its power-to-weight ratio, aerodynamic efficiency, and handling harmony seemed to exist in perfect balance. Even its dive performance, where German fighters once held advantage, proved equal or superior, as the Mustang retained stability and control well beyond speeds where others risked disintegration. After the flight, the aircraft was rolled before the assembled men. Pilots and ground crews were invited to inspect it up close, its cockpit layout, its systems, the ingenious simplicity of its design. The Germans noted how accessible every system was, how maintenance could be performed quickly and efficiently, and how logical the cockpit arrangement appeared compared to their own cramped, heavily framed cockpits. The American designers, it seemed, had built not just for performance, but for the pilot's endurance and the mechanic's sanity. At some bases, Rosarius allowed selected aces to take the Mustang aloft under close supervision. Many returned humbled, even shaken. They reported that the aircraft's controls were so balanced, so instinctive, that it almost seemed to anticipate the pilot's thoughts. "It is," one Luftwaffe ace confessed, "like wrestling with a wolf only to find it understands you better than you do." These exhibitions weren't merely educational, they were psychological. The Luftwaffe had prided itself on technical superiority since the days of the Blitzkrieg. To confront a machine that eclipsed their finest designs in so many categories was to stare into the growing realization that the air war had turned irrevocably against them. In hangars and mess halls afterward, young pilots spoke in hushed tones, their bravado thinning beneath the weight of what they'd seen. They understood now that no amount of courage could make up for an aircraft that could outrun, outclimb, and outfight them. Still, the Wanderzirkus pressed on, its mission more vital than ever. Across the collapsing Reich, Rosarius and his men continued their strange campaign, educating pilots, gathering data, and documenting the shifting balance of air power. Wherever the captured Mustang appeared, it carried with it not just lessons in aerodynamics and tactics, but a silent, undeniable truth. The sky no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The more the Luftwaffe studied the captured Mustang, the more they came to a grim realization. This was no mere machine of war. It was a philosophy rendered in metal, a blueprint of Allied industrial might and design logic that Germany could scarcely hope to match in 1944. At Rechlin and other Luftwaffe test centers, engineers pored over every inch of the Mustang's airframe, probing its secrets like archaeologists, uncovering a lost civilization. What they found left them both impressed and unsettled. The airframe's sleek laminar flow wing design reduced drag to levels that seemed almost magical. It wasn't just the Mustang's engine that made it fast. It was the marriage of aerodynamic science and practical engineering. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, license-built in America by Packard, turned raw horsepower into refined thrust. The Germans had built superb engines before, the Daimler-Benz DB605 in the Bf 109, the BMW 801 in the FW 190. But the Merlin's combination of power, reliability, and altitude performance gave the Mustang a breathtaking edge. Even at 25,000 feet, where German fighters gasped for breath, the Mustang still surged forward with confidence. Inside the cockpit, simplicity reigned. Switches were arranged by function, gauges clearly marked, the gun sight perfectly aligned with the pilot's natural line of sight. German aircraft, though mechanically advanced, often suffered from complexity that taxed pilots under pressure. In the Mustang, everything was intuitive. One test pilot remarked, "The American designs as if he fights every day. The German designs as if he studies every day." It was a subtle but devastating difference, a reflection of a war machine built for efficiency rather than perfectionism. Then there was the range, the factor that truly broke the Luftwaffe's back. The Mustang could escort bombers from England deep into Germany and still return home. No German fighter could match that. The Me-109 and FW-190, for all their brilliance, were short-legged defenders. They could fight fiercely near their bases, but were helpless once the bombers reached central Germany. The captured Mustang demonstrated what every German commander feared. The Reich was now vulnerable everywhere all the time. The air war had become one of endurance, and Germany's fuel reserves, industry, and manpower could not sustain it. When German engineers studied the Mustang's manufacturing methods, their awe deepened. Rivets were standardized, panels interchangeable, and components mass-produced with uncanny precision. The aircraft bore the mark of a nation that had industrialized its war effort to near perfection. The Germans, despite their engineering genius, still relied on labor-intensive production and scarce materials. For every Mustang the Allies built, Germany could barely assemble a single fighter. At Luftwaffe headquarters, reports from the Wanderzirkus and Rechlin circulated among senior officers. Some dismissed them as curiosities, interesting but irrelevant to a war already lost. Others, especially the technical branches, took them as warnings from the edge of defeat. If such efficiency and innovation defined America's air power now, what would it look like in another year? Yet amid the technical fascination, a subtle respect began to take root. German pilots, especially veterans of the Eastern Front, had long respected courage, skill, and innovation, no matter the uniform. The Mustang embodied all three. They studied its blueprints, tested its performance, and even borrowed ideas from its systems for their own designs. Some features later appeared in late-war German prototypes: the Ta-152, the Me-262's cockpit layout, and improved fuel systems, all inspired in part by lessons learned from the captured P-51. But these lessons came too late. As the Luftwaffe dwindled, its fuel supplies evaporating, and its skies dominated by swarms of Allied aircraft, the captured Mustang became less a subject of study and more a symbol of what could never be regained. It was the mirror in which the Luftwaffe saw its past glory fade, and the future of air combat staring back, sleek, relentless, and unmistakably American. By early 1945, the Mustang had evolved from a promising newcomer into the undisputed ruler of the skies. Every German pilot knew its silhouette: the long nose, the elegant canopy, the unmistakable roar of the Merlin engine as it descended like a hawk upon its prey. To fly against a Mustang was to face death on equal terms, for it was not only fast and heavily armed, but flown by men hardened through relentless air battles across Europe. Yet the Luftwaffe, battered and desperate, still rose to meet them. In those final months, air combat over Germany became a duel of endurance and spirit, veterans versus innovation, courage versus inevitability. German pilots, many barely in their 20s, climbed into their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, knowing they were outnumbered 10-1. They carried the weight of a dying Reich on their shoulders, yet their determination burned as fierce as ever. From airfields hidden among forests and villages, they took off at dawn, engines coughing to life amid the echoes of artillery from the front lines. Their mission was clear: intercept the endless streams of American bombers and their Mustang escorts before they reached the industrial heart of Germany. The first sight of the Mustang in combat was unnerving. It flew differently, graceful yet aggressive, its turns precise, its dives controlled, and its recovery almost instantaneous. German pilots who had once dominated Europe's skies with their Bf-109s now found themselves hunted. The Mustang's long range meant there was no sanctuary, no moment to regroup. Even over Berlin or the Ruhr Valley, the P-51s were there, circling above the bombers, waiting for the Luftwaffe to rise. A single mistake in timing or maneuver meant instant destruction. The 650 caliber machine guns of the Mustang tore through the air like thunder, cutting enemy aircraft to ribbons before they could even fire back. Yet in those duels, there were moments of incredible skill and defiance. Some Luftwaffe aces, men like Erich Hartmann, Günther Rahl and Walter Schuck, fought Mustangs in heart-stopping engagements where sheer instinct and experience kept them alive. They learned to bait the Americans into climbs, to force overshoots, to exploit the Mustang's slight disadvantage in low-speed turns. But even when they won, they knew the victory was fleeting. For every Mustang destroyed, 10 more arrived the next day. The tide was irreversible. In one recorded encounter near Magdeburg, a German pilot named Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Schumann, flying a battered Fu-190, engaged 3 Mustangs head-on. Outgunned and outmatched, he dove through their formation, his aircraft shaking violently from the stress. He managed to shoot one down, but was struck seconds later by a burst of tracer fire. As his plane spiraled toward the earth, he radioed his final words, "They fight like we once did." It was a haunting acknowledgement of respect and resignation. The Luftwaffe's high command, aware of its dwindling resources, began saving fuel for its few jet fighters, the Me-262s, but even the jet's speed advantage could not fully restore the balance. Mustangs prowled around airfields, ambushing jets as they took off or landed, exploiting their vulnerability in moments when power met fragility. The skies over Germany became a graveyard of both courage and machinery, where innovation and desperation collided in every engagement. For the Allied pilots, the duels were no less personal. They had trained for years to reach this point, flying thousands of miles over enemy territory, watching friends fall in flames beside them. Yet each time they faced a German fighter, they knew they were witnessing the final gasps of a once dominant air force. Every victory was tinged with respect for the skill of the enemy, for the engineering brilliance of their machines, and for the knowledge that air supremacy had been bought with blood, ingenuity, and relentless perseverance. By spring, the duels in the sky had grown rare. The Luftwaffe was running on fumes, its aircraft grounded, its pilots gone. The Mustang flew on unchallenged, patrolling the skies over a collapsing Germany. The duel was over, and history had chosen its champion, not merely through power but through vision. The Mustang had proven that mastery of the air was no longer about who could fly faster, but who could imagine the future first. In the final weeks of the war, curiosity overcame pride. The Luftwaffe, now fractured and desperate, had captured a fully intact P-51 Mustang that had force-landed behind German lines near Hanover. The aircraft, gleaming silver, its insignia hastily covered with German crosses, was unlike anything their engineers had ever touched. It was quickly brought to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's secret test facility, where the nation's finest pilots and engineers examined it under the watchful eyes of officers who still clung to a fading hope of regaining air superiority. The test pilots who gathered there were veterans, men who had flown everything from the Bf-109 to the Me-262 jet. They were no strangers to precision engineering, yet as they ran their hands along the Mustang's fuselage, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that they were looking at something extraordinary. When Hauptmann Hans Dortenmann climbed into the cockpit, the first thing he noticed was the visibility. The canopy offered a full panoramic view of the horizon, something German fighters had long lacked. There were no bulky frames to obstruct vision, no blind spots to hide enemies. The cockpit layout was surprisingly ergonomic, with instruments clearly arranged and easy to reach. When he started the engine, the deep, steady purr of the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin filled the hangar, a sound smoother and more confident than any Daimler-Benz engine he'd ever heard. Even before takeoff, Dortenmann sensed what made this fighter different. It was not just built to fight, but to endure. As the Mustang lifted into the grey German sky, it climbed effortlessly, the controls light and responsive. The aircraft obeyed every movement of the stick, as if it anticipated the pilot's thoughts. Leveling out at 20,000 feet, Dortenmann pushed the throttle forward and watched the speedometer climb, 350, 380, 400 miles per hour. The plane didn't shudder or resist. It simply surged ahead, steady and unflinching. In a gentle roll, he tested its balance and was astonished by the harmony of control surfaces. The P-51 could dive steeply without compressibility problems, then recover smoothly with minimal stick pressure. It was the kind of stability German pilots could only dream of during high-speed maneuvers. When he landed and climbed out, Dortemann was silent. His peers gathered around, waiting for the verdict. Finally, he said, "This aircraft, it flies as if it wants to live." The engineers took note, dissecting every inch of the design. The laminar flow wings that reduce drag, the efficient cooling system, the perfect marriage of aerodynamics and power. They realized with quiet dread that this was no fluke of luck but the result of engineering foresight and industrial mastery. The Mustang was not only superior, it was sustainable. It could be built in thousands, maintained easily and flown by pilots with minimal fatigue over long distances. Reports from the test flight reached high command. Even hardened officers, men who had dismissed Allied aircraft as crude imitations, were forced to concede the truth. General Adolf Galland himself remarked privately, "The Mustang is the best all-around fighter of the war. It has everything right." For the first time, Germany's aviation elite saw clearly what they were truly fighting against. Not just Allied pilots, but an entire system of innovation and mass production that Germany could no longer match. The test of truth had stripped away illusions. The Luftwaffe's designs were brilliant but specialized, built for short missions, high performance, and limited endurance. The Mustang was built for the modern war, efficient, balanced, and adaptable. It was a machine born not just from genius, but from the collective effort of engineers, industry, and logistics. That realization cut deeper than any defeat in combat. In the weeks that followed, Rechlin's test pilots continued to fly the captured Mustang, each one confirming the same verdict. They marveled at its smooth handling, its range, its reliability. But admiration turned quickly to sorrow, for they knew it symbolized the end of their era. The skies that once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to this foreign creation, sleek, fast, and unstoppable. The Mustang had not merely conquered the air, it had conquered the very idea of what air power could be. By the spring of 1945, word of the captured Mustang's performance had rippled through the shattered ranks of the Luftwaffe, like a rumor of defeat given form. Every pilot who heard the reports of its effortless climb, its stability, its unmatched range, understood the unspoken truth. The Allies had engineered an aircraft that embodied the future, while Germany's own designs, though brilliant, belonged to a past that was rapidly fading away. In briefing rooms and makeshift hangars, engineers and aviators gathered to study the reports from Rechlin, their faces lit by the dim glow of lanterns as they traced every diagram, every specification, searching desperately for flaws that simply did not exist. They found none. The Mustang, they realized, was not only faster than the Bf 109 and the FW 190, but it could also fight longer, escort deeper, and strike harder, all while being easier to maintain. It was the complete weapon of air dominance. The reaction among German pilots was not anger, but awe. They had fought against it for months, cursing its endurance as they scrambled to intercept bombers over the Ruhr or Berlin, always with those sleek silver predators circling above. Now seeing one up close and understanding how it truly worked, many could only shake their heads in disbelief. "It's like it breathes differently," one test pilot remarked. "Ours fight against the air. This one moves with it." To a generation of flyers who had grown up idolizing the speed and climb of the Messerschmitt, the Mustang represented a new kind of mastery, one born not from raw aggression, but from balance and harmony. In Luftwaffe headquarters, General Galland received a detailed report on the captured P-51. It concluded, with rare bluntness, that no current or planned German aircraft could match the Mustang's operational versatility. Its combination of speed, agility, and range had allowed the Allies to impose strategic air superiority over the entire continent, a feat Germany's engineers had deemed impossible only a few years earlier. The Me-262 jet still held the edge in speed, but its endurance was too short, its maintenance too complex, and its availability too limited. The Mustang, powered by its Merlin engine and fueled by industrial efficiency, could simply be built faster, flown longer, and fielded in far greater numbers. That, in the end, was the defining difference between victory and annihilation. Among the engineers who studied the captured Mustang was a young designer named Kurt Tank, the mind behind the Focke-Wulf 190. He was said to have stood beside the captured aircraft in silence for several minutes before whispering, "This is how we should have built it. His words carried a heavy recognition that Germany's pursuit of technological superiority had often ignored practicality. While German aircraft pushed the limits of innovation, they demanded the finest materials, the most experienced pilots, and meticulous maintenance, all luxuries the Reich could no longer afford. The Mustang, in contrast, was designed for war as it truly was, messy, brutal, and industrial. It could be repaired on muddy airfields, flown by thousands of young men trained in weeks, and still dominate the sky. As Allied bombers thundered overhead and the distant echoes of artillery rolled closer to Berlin, the captured Mustang stood in its hangar like a silent prophecy. Mechanics continued to study it, even as the walls trembled from near bomb strikes. The irony was bitter. Germany's best minds, once leaders in aviation, now learning from their conqueror's creation. In those final days, even the most loyal officers could no longer deny it. The war for the skies had been lost long before the armies on the ground surrendered. It was lost the moment the Allies realized that victory was not only about invention, but about execution, standardization, and endurance. The shockwave of that realization spread beyond the war itself. For every German pilot who had once looked down upon Allied machinery, the Mustang was a revelation and a reckoning. It wasn't just an aircraft. It was a symbol of a turning world. The age of the lone ace and the handcrafted fighter was ending. In its place rose the era of strategic air power, where science, mass production, and teamwork defined supremacy. As Germany's skies fell silent and the Reich crumbled beneath Allied fire, the men who had flown against the Mustang knew they had witnessed the end of an era and the beginning of another, one forged in the roar of the Merlin engine and the shadow of its silver wings. By April 1945, the skies above Germany were no longer battlefields, they were graveyards. The once proud Luftwaffe, forged in the fires of Blitzkrieg and sustained by legends of aerial mastery, was shattered beyond recognition. Airfields that had once launched waves of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs now stood in ruin, pocked with craters, littered with burnt wreckage, and silent except for the echo of Allied engines overhead. The Mustang ruled the air unchallenged, a symbol of both technological superiority and the relentless industrial will that had made it possible. For German pilots who still took to the skies, the fight had become one of honor, not victory. Every mission was a farewell to the sky they once owned. Those who had seen the captured Mustang knew the truth intimately. The war had been lost not in the air, but in the factories and laboratories that lay behind it. Allied engineers had outthought, outbuilt, and outlasted the Reich. Where German genius had created brilliance in isolation, Allied cooperation had forged dominance in unison. The Mustang was not the fastest aircraft, nor the most heavily armed, but it was perfect where it mattered most. It was reliable, efficient, and adaptable. It could escort bombers deep into the heart of Germany, dogfight at any altitude, and return home without refueling. The Luftwaffe had no answer. As American formations swept over the Rhine and deeper into the collapsing Reich, the skies filled with the low, confident hum of Merlin engines. P-51s flew in perfect formation, their silver bodies gleaming in the sun as symbols of inevitable victory. They hunted the last surviving German aircraft with merciless precision, intercepting them before they could even gain altitude. Many Luftwaffe pilots never saw their attackers. They were struck from above by invisible predators. The air war had turned from contest to extermination. Veteran aces who had once ruled Europe's skies met their end in those final weeks. Erich Hartmann, Germany's highest-scoring ace, survived the war but recalled the hopelessness of those final sorties. "We flew because it was our duty, not because we believed we could win." Others, like Gerhard Barkhorn and Walter Nowotny, were not so fortunate. Each loss marked the fading of a generation that had defined aerial combat for nearly a decade. The Luftwaffe's young replacements, barely trained, often with fewer than 10 hours in flight, were slaughtered before they even saw an enemy. It was not a battle anymore. It was annihilation. On the ground, the sight of Mustangs streaking overhead became an omen of collapse. Columns of retreating German soldiers looked skyward in fear, for they knew the roar of those engines meant death from above. Trains, convoys, and even isolated vehicles were strafed with terrifying precision. There was no safe road, no safe hour, no safe place left in Hitler's Reich. The Mustang had become the iron messenger of fate. Yet even amid destruction, there was a strange respect. German engineers who examined wrecked Mustangs spoke of them not with bitterness but with admiration. "It is a masterpiece," one said quietly. "We could have built it, if only we had time." In one of the last test flights at Rechlin, a German pilot named Oberstleutnant Heinrich Dietrich took the captured Mustang aloft once more, even as Allied troops closed in on the facility. As he soared into the cold spring sky, he radioed a final report. "To fly this plane is to glimpse the future. We have lost, but aviation has won." Hours later, Allied soldiers entered the airfield and found the Mustang undamaged, its canopy open, the fuel tanks dry. Dietrich had landed it gently, walked away and disappeared into the chaos of surrender. His quiet tribute, like so many unrecorded gestures of the defeated, spoke louder than any order or speech. By the time Berlin fell, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The eagle of Germany had fallen, and in its place soared the silver wings of the Mustang. It was a triumph of engineering over ego, of endurance over brilliance. For those who had fought against it, the Mustang became not a symbol of humiliation, but of transformation, a machine that marked the end of one world and the dawn of another. In its contrails lay both the ruin of the old empire and the blueprint for the skies of the modern age. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the world that emerged from the ashes of war was unrecognizable. The great cities of Europe lay in ruins, their cathedrals shattered, their skies cleared of the smoke that had darkened them for years. But above that silence, one aircraft remained in flight, the Mustang. It soared over a conquered continent, not as a weapon of vengeance, but as a symbol of what human ingenuity, unity, and sacrifice could achieve when guided by purpose rather than pride. For the Allied pilots returning home, the P-51 was more than just a machine. It was a lifeline. It had carried them across the vast distances of war, shielded them in the furnace of combat, and delivered them back again. Many called it the fighter that ended the air war. Others called it the plane that won Europe. In hangars and airfields across the defeated Reich, German engineers walked among the captured Mustangs, studying their contours with a mixture of envy and reverence. These men, masters of aviation who had once defined the cutting edge of flight, now saw in this foreign machine the future of all aircraft design. Its laminar flow wings, streamlined cooling systems, and unmatched performance at high altitude became the foundation of post-war aviation on both sides of the Atlantic. From the ashes of their defeat, they understood something profound. The Mustang had not been born from chance. It was the product of an idea, the belief that innovation must serve the mission, not ego. It was a weapon forged by necessity, refined by cooperation, and perfected through relentless testing. In the years that followed, the Mustang's roar would echo not just in Europe but across new skies. In Korea it would fight again, this time as a veteran among jets, proving that even in the dawn of a new era, brilliance from the past could still hold its own. And in museums decades later, when children would gaze upon its silver wings, they would see not just a machine of war, but a monument to courage, ingenuity, and transformation. The P-51 had transcended its time. It had become a bridge between generations of flight, between destruction and progress, between war and peace. For the Germans who had once flown against it, the memory of the Mustang remained vivid and bittersweet. Many of them, now older and free from the burden of propaganda, would later admit their awe for it. General Adolf Galland himself, once a bitter rival, famously said, "The P-51 Mustang is the finest fighter of World War II. It could do everything." His words were not defeat, they were respect, born from the shared brotherhood of men, who risked their lives in the unforgiving expanse of the sky. The Mustang had earned that respect, not through overwhelming numbers alone, but through balance, discipline, and vision, the very qualities that defined aviation's evolution. As the post-war world entered an age of reconstruction, the lessons of the Mustang resonated beyond aircraft design. It symbolized a philosophy that victory belonged not to the most powerful, but to those who adapted, learned, and endured. Factories that once built war machines now turned to making engines for peace, transport planes, commercial liners, and the first jets that would carry civilians across oceans. The engineers who once built Mustangs applied their genius to rebuilding the world, turning destruction into renewal. In the end, the story of the Mustang was not about war, it was about transformation. Born in crisis, perfected in battle, and immortalized in peace, it represented the moment humanity turned the sky from a killing ground into a frontier of dreams. As the sun set over the fields of Europe, its silver wings caught the last light, glinting like a promise. The age of the Luftwaffe had ended, but from its fall had risen something greater, a new era of aviation where the spirit of flight belonged to all mankind. And in that endless sky, the Mustang still flies, not as a relic of war, but as a testament to what humanity can build when it dares to dream beyond the horizon.